Greetings, legendary listeners. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for insightful and entertaining discussions of Marvel television. Moon Knight is just around the corner, and we are here with a very literary preview for you to get you fired up for the 6-episode season. I am your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Folletti. And of course, on this episode, I am joined by our two Storycast experts.
Hi, I'm Maeve Adams, a professor of English at Manhattan College and director of their Digital Arts and Humanities program.
Hi, I'm Amanda Marcotte. I'm a senior politics writer at Salon.com.
All right. Well, look, we're going to talk about a lot of weird stuff today because Moon Knight is a very strange and unusual story. It's a fascinating character to pull forth from the comics, and I'm really excited to talk to y'all. We're not going to talk a ton about the comics. We're going to talk a lot about the things that define the character and the story of Moon Knight, the things that might come up in this show. For example, we'll get into a little bit about Moon Knight and his quote-unquote split personalities. We'll talk a little bit about the stories and themes that have relied on that kind of trope before, how they might play into the story, and a little bit more about that. We'll get into some symbology of Egypt and the moon. And of course, we're going to talk about Moon Knight's oft-compared DC counterpart, Batman, and why we are drawn to those kinds of stories. But let's start, gang, with these questions about personalities, multiple personalities, split personalities, because in the comics and in the show, Marc Spector, aka Moon Knight, will have a lot of personalities. He's got at least 3 to 4 at any given time, and I'm sure he's going to have that many based on the trailers and how he keeps splitting apart and talking to himself in various forms and outfits, that's going to be the case, right? So I guess I want to start with you, Amanda. I'm curious, are you into the idea of a story about a superhero with a split personality, or does that give you some pause?
I confess it gives me a lot of pause because there's a long history of multiple personality disorder being this kind of fake, titillating narrative device in a lot of tabloid fiction, and including in Moon Knight in some of its comic runs. To be clear, there's a lot of people that still to this day get a dissociative identity disorder diagnosis, but by and large, the understanding of the psychological community is multiple personality disorder isn't a thing. When people thought it was a real thing, which would be kind of right when Moon Knight was first being written, it was something that got a lot of attention for the psychologists that were really kind of hyping it, but it turned out that it was more of a psychologist-induced psychiatric disorder than it was a real authentic thing that people were experiencing. All the kind of hallmarks of it, the supposed memory loss, the actual switching between personalities, all that, it seems like it was being somewhere in the realm of being faked by some people to sort of something that they were performing to please their psychiatrist. So I always am a little wary of these stories because they have a long history of making a spectacle out of mental health issues that I really wish were handled more responsibly in most multiple personality disorder stories.
Why do you think people are drawn to that kind of a thing? Why would they, whether it's a psychologist or these writers or whatever, why is this something that has entered the consciousness and captured so many people's imaginations? Why would you fake something like this, or consciously or subconsciously want to fake something like this?
For a lot of the patients that did it, it was a permission structure thing. It was about acting out in ways that they didn't want to own under their quote unquote real personality. And then it got worse because it was so obviously pleasing to the psychologists that more and more personalities would just erupt all over the place. So I think, and I think that's kind of the appeal of it. That's why it's such a titillating idea in fiction, both good and bad fiction, because it's a cool idea, the idea that you have this other self that can act and behave in ways that you wouldn't act. Sure. And that you don't have to have responsibility for it because in a sense, it's not actually you, even if it is your body.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense too that a psychiatrist would try to understand incoherent behavior with respect to declared motivation, not by way of, look, there's this complex psyche that we're going to have to unravel in these really sort of drawn out and messy ways by saying, well, there's just multiple personalities here. Although the dissociative identity disorder is in the DSM-5. So it's still that's associated with post-traumatic disorder and...
Yeah, but I think they've taken out a lot of the sense that you're actually different people who have different memories and all that other stuff that really kind of got exaggerated during the multiple personality disorder craze. And a lot of that was in the mid 20th century, a lot of psychologists had bad incentive structures to get fame and fortune by selling these lurid books. And unfortunately, it got really associated with things like repressed memories and the satanic ritual, panic, and other extremely bad malpractice behaviors from certain psychologists. So I always say approach this particular topic with great caution.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that it's been part of the effort to understand post-traumatic stress disorder, at least as I understand it. And I think that's something that I'll be curious to see this story grapple with, because we have a person who was a Marine and then went from being a Marine and with all the feelings he had about having served in the military, turned to a kind of rageful mercenary. And so obviously there's something going on there that has to do with post-traumatic stress. And so I do kind of hope that that's what we're moving in the direction of here, as opposed to kind of you're right, some kind of melodramatic and sensational narrative of multiple personalities. I mean, it's also true here that, there's some sense that this character may be talking to himself a lot. So it's not like the multiple personality disorder thing that exactly what you're talking about, where someone doesn't have responsibility for their actions because they've got all these other personalities sort of conveniently stored away in their brain that they can drag out to do the bad things.
Yeah, I think when people hear disassociation related to trauma, they have this notion that somebody just literally blacks out and doesn't remember what happened.
Yeah.
And it's not. I think most people have actually disassociated and didn't know it, even if that wasn't trauma. It's really just that feeling of just for some reason feeling like you're on the outside looking in on your own experience, which I think sometimes happens just kind of randomly, if you're in a particularly meditative mood or whatever. And it definitely happens in trauma. But I think it's important not to make more out of disassociation than it is. It really is just kind of a weird sense of your brain of being in two places at once.
Well, and even the research around it, as I understand it, that talks about the identities part of it, says that this is more dissociative identity disorder is more about one identity fragmenting and splintering and fracturing. Right? You have parts of yourself that you're kind of not letting yourself access or shutting off at different points depending on what's happening as a result, usually, of trauma, as Maeve was talking about. Whereas multiple personality disorder, right, the idea was there's these wholly distinct beings with different identities, different complete people in one person, as opposed to parts of yourself that are split across these different ways of basically compartmentalizing stuff you're not equipped to process or handle, right? That makes sense. That's a thing I think that's what you're saying. It's we've all experienced some modest form of that kind of disassociation where you just kind of can't let yourself see something or access something, especially if you've been through something rough. And so,
Whereas,
it's interesting.
Multiple personality disorder would be I have 5 personalities that have different names and different genders and are different ages,
And Barbara likes to steal.
Right. The sensationalized ones were only one part of you can speak French, right? That part, there's some part of you that somehow magically knows another language and that you
wish.
That sort of a thing, right? People have kind of sensationalized that aspect of it. But regardless, this kind of thing, and especially the fully sort of, look, this is a supernatural story with gods and magic. So if there was ever going to be a story in which you could have multiple people inhabiting one person, it would be something like inside the Marvel Universe, right? So there are a lot of other famous works, Maeve, I am assuming, that have drawn on this split personality concept to tell a story. Is there any one that you feel most interested in sharing or talking about as we look ahead to Moon Knight?
There are lots of split personality stories from especially the 19th and 20th centuries that I think come out of an interest in the psyche, right? So Sigmund Freud, product of the 19th century into the 20th century, thinking about what it would mean if the mind was not singular, not coherent and cohesive. But I think, there was, when I was reading through some of the comic books and the different sort of iterations, sort of starting in 2014, moving forward, I just kept getting this like Invisible Man vibe. And I think that the reason for that had something to do with what we were just talking about, that this is not exactly your kind of classic split personality story, because he's aware of all these other pieces of himself. He just can't quite put them together. There's this kind of fragmentation that's happening. And it's not just potentially a product of trauma, although it is a product of trauma. There's all this other complexity that's written into that character that I will be curious to see if they play with or sort of dig into. For example, one of the sort of early iterations of Moon Knight was that he starts his life out as the son of a rabbi and essentially gives up religion, sort of rejects his father, and goes and joins the military. And that, of course, goes horribly wrong because of all the trauma that he experiences there. And then he becomes this violent mercenary. And there's a turn that happens when he's sort of trying to move away from that. And of course, it makes a certain amount of sense that he seeks a deity to connect with, because he's sort of, there's a kind of return to spiritual self or something. But in the comic books, it's written as a kind of a reckoning with his Jewish heritage. And for folks who don't know the story, not of H.G. Wells's The Invisible Man, but Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. This is Ralph Ellison's attempt to totally rewrite the story of the Invisible Man from the perspective of a Black man who feels divided between two pieces of himself. And he borrows this from W.E.B. Du Bois. And the idea there is that there's the Black man who is seen by the world in one very particular way that is demeaning and subordinating. And then there is the struggle to figure out how to see yourself as something other than subordinate. And so there's this double consciousness that you experience, the experience of knowing yourself as this subordinated being, pitied even at best. And then the desire to know yourself as something other than that. And so I think that there's a possibility that that kind of Jewish heritage will be of interest there. If that's something, if the thing that I'm picking up on this sort of Invisible Man vibe is not just, a creature of my imagination, it's actually going to, have some expression in the story.
Yeah. What's funny about like multiple personality disorder stories is that it was for a time in the mid 20th century seen as a real mental illness. And yet when you look at literature, you can see that the idea of multiple personalities predates the psychological literature, the diagnosis, the concept of it. Before it came to be, it persists after multiple personality disorders gone out of fashion. You see it in obviously the most famous example is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but I would say like any werewolf story, right?
Yeah.
Is a story or stories of demonic possession. A lot of these are the same kind of concept of like the person who is like the normal pulled together person in the daylight, and then at night they turn into somebody entirely different or under demonic influence or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that this is a real good example of how a lot of what is often considered scientific knowledge draws on mythical knowledge, at least initially.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And then, in this particular case, I think has gone back to where it belongs, which is in the realm of literature and myth and not in the world of psychology, where we need to be a little bit more responsible about these things.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny too, because Jekyll and Hyde is a story that is essentially a cautionary tale about science, right? Science sort of taking over everything. And when you pursue scientific inquiry to the exclusion of your humanity, so that, when Dr. Jekyll produces Mr. Hyde, he divorces himself from his own humanity and then can run around the world and be evil. It's not that different from H.G. Wells's The Invisible Man, which is also it's a cautionary tale about science and the way that it produces these selves that no longer can connect to their humanity. And I think there's a piece of that here, but and I think you're right. Like, so basically the problem with science for 19th century writers and readers is that it excluded a sense of the sacredness of humans and our sacred duty to one another. Even if it's not strictly religious, it's about a kind of sacredness to our humanity that we lose. And in losing it, we become violent and horrible, and we need to be destroyed because we no longer belong to the sort of, the world of the human. But there's something else here too that's suggested maybe about how the modern world does this differently. So what purpose has science been put to in modernity? That's war. I mean,
right.
We're sitting around anxious right now about the end result of the nuclear age, what could be the end result, which is basically, mutual annihilation. And we're actually worried about it again. I mean, not that we weren't worried about it before, but there's real reason to be anxious about this. We have devoted all of these energies to producing weapons of war. And yes, we've also devoted energies to producing, things that are going to maybe help the planet, but we seem much less interested in pursuing those things than in pursuing either things that will bring us profit. So electric cars, good for the planet, but really mostly good for, rich people's pocketbooks, and weapons of war. And this is a story about war and what it might do to sort of fragment or void or threaten the humanity of the person who is put into the service of that technology.
It's funny because it's like you can also put a feminist gender angle on this too, because obviously the very first sci-fi story probably ever, and the one that's obsessed with this theme is Frankenstein, written by a woman, and it's about science perverting, a male scientist basically trying to steal women's generative power and how badly that goes, right?
Yeah.
And like, there's a lot, I think, there in the idea that like this kind of hyper scientific destructive mentality is masculine. It's coded as masculine in literature. And then like the more nature oriented, productive, reproductive, health-oriented kind of take is coded as female.
Yeah.
And it's just want to just put a pin on that, because the moon is also coded as female and the sun is coded as male in these kind of very similar ways. And a lot of these stories, I think, do kind of play a little with the idea that the feminine is also very dangerous and primal. And so it makes sense that like werewolves and stuff are associated with these kind of feminine energies.
Yeah.
We are also, talking about split personalities and science gone wrong. And it strikes me that Moon Knight is not the first Marvel character even to address these issues, right? The Incredible Hulk is the most famous example, right, of a Marvel character in which a scientist does the Jekyll and Hyde thing, basically creates the other version of himself that can run around letting out all the rage that he's unable to express. And, obviously that turns into something in the MCU where his two sides are literally fighting for control of his body in Infinity War, or rather like, they're not able to work together. And then by Endgame, he's like figured out some sort of peace between all the parts of himself. So Marvel's definitely gone down this road, and most of the origin stories of the characters from the 60s, Moon Knight coming in the 70s, but a lot of the 60s characters were all about these sort of like science gone wrong. And what's interesting, though, is that Moon Knight is very much not a science-based character. So it'll be interesting to see how they play with, Hulk, who's the science-based version of this, and then you have Moon Knight, who's going to be the sort of mythical version of that. But regardless of that, Amanda, we've talked a lot about some of these stories. Werewolves, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, both Invisible Man stories. What are some of the common themes that keep popping up in works that use this device of split personalities?
I mean, the most common is the idea that of the animal inside, right? That humans are, and it's true, humans are animals, right? And
what?
There's... And then there's this like veneer of civilization that we put over them. And then almost always these stories are about some primal unhinged animal bestial side coming out. Like I said, sometimes it's coded as feminine, sometimes it's coded as animal, sometimes it's coded as science gone wrong. It doesn't matter. It's always about somebody who's in control, a normal human being who, for whatever reason, this supernatural or scientific or whatever thing turns them into somebody who has two selves or five selves or whatever. And those other selves are about letting that part of yourself that never get that primal side of you come out, that like monster side come out. And it's, the most classic kind of horror movie versions of this are very straightforward. The other self is an evil self. They're bad. They're a threat to society, like werewolves, demon possessions, the Exorcist, things like that. I'm also interested in stories that use it to kind of explore the way that social repression is bad and that like we should have a little bit of our wild side coming out. Like that Pixar movie Turning Red is a werewolf story that's like pro-werewolf, right?
Yeah.
It says the panda's good, let the panda out. I think there's been some good like comedy, like Jennifer's Body, that kind of does a feminist take on this, where it's like, not saying that it's good for Jennifer to be a murderer, but like it's definitely kind of exploring the idea that that murderous urge comes from repression, and there might have been a healthier way to let it out.
I just watched a movie that is potentially kind of related to this. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a horror film, 2021, I think, or 2020, called The Stylist, which is about a woman who is a hairstylist and also a serial killer. And she's not exactly the part of herself that kills is not quite repressed in the sense that like we might imagine repression to operate in a kind of standard way. She knows that she's a serial killer, but she also does it because she doesn't get to be her complete self all the time. And her complete self is not necessarily a violent person, but part of what you're saying about social repression, right? The whole story is kind of written about her relationship to her clients and how they live these complete lives. And she's just there kind of in the service of their self-realization. And so she doesn't get to self-realize in any way. And so the result of that is that she kills them and cuts their scalps off and puts it on her own head, which, as you do when you want to be somebody else. It's really not funny. It's a really gross story, but it's a really interesting movie from the perspective of what you're talking about, right? What's the animal part of ourselves that comes out when we're told we don't get to be a complete self, a kind of complete human, which I think is another way probably of reading, the Hulk. He doesn't get to be macho. And so there's this sort of like, or his macho-ness is conceived, his excess macho-ness is conceived as this like aberration that he's not allowed to kind of like, have all those feelings or whatever. Like that's how it's played in the.
Yeah. I mean, he's, especially in the original comics, like a proto-incel type guy in the sense that he's just this like, little wimpy scientist guy, Bruce Banner, and, what's the fantasy of every little wimpy kid from the 60s, right? To, have the rage let loose, thanks to, sort of gamma radiation, right?
Well, and the cure for Hulk, right, is to integrate both sides of himself, right?
Right.
Sure, absolutely. Right. Although it comes and goes. But again, that's all very science-based, and our guy now is going to be, dealing with something else. Maeve, what about you? Is there a theme that you see running through these kinds of split personality, multiple personality stories?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to go back to The Invisible Man, which I think we could spend all day talking about that story, but I actually wanted to talk a little bit about Du Bois, because little fun fact about W.E.B. Du Bois, who theorized the idea of double consciousness, part of his process of making sense of that involved him going to the Warsaw Ghetto after the uprising. He spent a lot of time in Germany, actually. I didn't know that until recently. He studied at the University of Berlin earlier in his life, and then went back to Germany and witnessed what had happened at Warsaw after the uprising. And he wrote this really beautiful essay about what he had seen there, where he basically argues, he calls it the Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto. And he says that he realizes kind of late in his theorization of double consciousness that the problem, what he calls the Negro problem, is not just a problem of race. It's a multifaceted complex of oppression that has to do with race and religion and class. He's got this really beautiful line near the end of the essay. He says, "The ghetto of Warsaw helped me to emerge from a certain social provincialism into a broader conception of what the fight against race segregation, religious discrimination, and the oppression by wealth had to become if civilization was to triumph and broaden in the world." Right? He's sort of looking for this kind of universalized language of liberation. And he realizes in this moment that to understand what it means to live in a subordinate position needs a broader context. And I do think that especially if this story like draws on his Jewish heritage, or if it draws on the kind of, to go back to Amanda's point about social oppression, if it talks about gender, right, and the way that the kind of strictures of gender force humans into this position of double consciousness, where, you, on the one hand, you feel like you see yourself one way, and yet the world sees you differently, just as an issue of conforming or non-conformity, then I think this story could do something really interesting with respect to violence more broadly, and sort of even kind of blowing out even further this understanding of oppression and liberation that Du Bois sort of, gets rolling in the early 20th century.
When you talk about this, it makes me think too that another angle to this could be a double consciousness of the vet having returned home from war.
Nice. Yeah.
Because I really do feel like the two selves lives in a lot of veterans who've seen especially like a lot of action, because there's a whole part, it's very normal, I think, for people who've been in the military to feel like they went through all these experiences that nobody back home can understand. And so they simply just repress that part of themselves and disappear that down a memory hole that they can only access when they're maybe around other people that shared it with them. And that was a really common theme in a lot of like post-World War II kind of narratives and post-Vietnam narratives. And now we have, a lot of people living in our society that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan that I think they're walking around, they're normal people, they're trying to live normal lives. And there's this whole part of themselves that is just shut off from the world. And it would be interesting to see if that feeds into this narrative at all.
Yeah, that's really smart. I hadn't thought about it that way at all, but you're totally right. And there are several different ways that could manifest itself. I mean, they could all manifest it. I mean, when you've got 5 characters to work with inside of you, you really have a plenitude of possibility here.
Indeed.
But, on the one hand, thinking about what you're talking about in terms of coming back from war and not feeling like anybody can really understand what you've been through. And so that kind of double sense of self with respect to the world. And then add to that, what you were saying about Vietnam is really interesting because it's related and different, because soldiers coming back from Vietnam also is the case with soldiers coming back from Iraq. They come back and there's this anti-war movement that has in many ways seen them as instruments of imperialism. And it's not wrong insofar as the American military is used imperialistically and has used its soldiers as instruments of imperialism, but they're seen that way as if they themselves chose to imperialize Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam. Fine, we can have a long debate about choice and, all of that, but that's kind of irrelevant to this. The fact is the double consciousness comes from being seen as one thing that you feel like is an incomplete or an unfair or a subordinating, oppressive vision of your selfhood, and then trying to reconcile that with something that you're trying to build inside of yourself, which is a self-consciousness that is not about your pitiable and pathetic state. And I think that could be really striking here. It would be a real rich dimension of the story.
Well, we talked at the top about how there's some potentially very real roots of disassociation and sort of splitting off parts of yourself, that form dissociative identity disorder, but multiple personality disorder is so seductive, and people have been on about this and on and sensationalized it. So, Maeve, are there any examples of split personality stories where they go off the rails or it makes you cringe because they play into that sensationalization?
Oh, man. I feel like this is something that I don't say very often because this movie is like so popular and people think it really got at like something important about American capitalism. I hate Fight Club. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I hate that movie. When I first saw it, I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. But then I saw it again and I was like, God, this is so, it's like a little adolescent, It's like,
Indeed.
Okay, so it's a story about a guy who thinks he's met a friend who helps him see that capitalism strips your soul of your humanity and makes your life a drudgery. And those things are, true for a lot of people. And I'm not critiquing that critique. That critique I'm here for. But the form that it takes in that film is that the solution is guys punching each other.
Right.
I mean, they try to problematize that in the movie for sure. I think it's more a diagnosis, right? Like the way that men turn to this like toxic masculinity we see that every day. Look at Joe Rogan's fandom.
It's true.
I agree that the movie doesn't stick the landing on that.
I mean, he shoots himself in a way that I think is sort of directly a result of the ultimate catastrophe of his like series of personality failings. I tend to agree that it's like more a diagnosis than it's definitely not a movie that's like, hey, you should start a fight club. In the same way that Swingers was not a movie that was like, hey, you should run around being a shallow asshole. Like it was a story that had a really charismatic character being really bad and convincing other people to do stupid shit. But then ultimately sort of it all collapses and falls apart. But it's also obsessed with the thing that it's claiming to critique.
Yes,
it's definitely very rooted in a sort of, it's definitely desperate for the approval of the toxic masculinity it's critiquing.
Totally. That's exactly right. And, the other thing too is like when we think about style in a film, right? When I teach film, I'm always like, what's the style of this film? Like, what does it look like to you? What are the scenes that are meant to draw you in and make you feel good, even if what they're showing is ugly? That film sensationalizes those fight scenes. It's aesthetically pleasing.
But I will say, okay, so let me put on my film scholar
Please do.
hat and say, like, all right, if I was to defend Fight Club, what I would say is, I mean, Tyler Durden is literally at times running around in essentially a children's tank top, right? He has like that with like silly patterned little shirt. And actually, they both look terrible all the time. I mean, terrible and poorly dressed. And their house is a disaster zone. And of course, the whole time they're telling themselves that it doesn't matter. Yeah. But it's a movie without a solution for the problem. And that's why I think that it falls into this weird trap. But I do think it's actually showing us like this is an infantile idea. And they dress Tyler for the part.
Well, then, and isn't that also like that's like a fantasy? Like I'm a boy and I don't have to take care of myself kind of thing. And I'm not saying that like all boys want to be like that.
Yes. But yeah, he is also literally a fantasy. So I want to point out.
But he's also portraying a fantasy that I feel like appeals to a group of folks that, maybe I don't imagine to be offering the most sophisticated critique of capitalism. So, but I mean, I know what you mean. You're right. You're not wrong exactly, Mark. I'm not sure I totally.
No, but I mean, I think, again, it doesn't have an answer. So it's like, hey, well, we just blew up a bunch of shit. And okay, maybe I guess I got a little off the deep end there, but it doesn't really solve it. So is there a better version of Fight Club out there, Maeve?
Oh my God. If you have not seen Jane Austen's Fight Club, which is a short film that is available on YouTube, then I feel like you haven't lived, honestly.
That's
it's
a real
wonderful
thing, Jane Austen's Fight Club.
So good. And it's basically sort of the setup is basically we have these women sitting around in a parlor, stitching something. And one of them suggests that they start a fight club and they do, and they start beating each other up. But what's wonderful about it is like they, the sort of, it does something more perfect with the critique because women aren't allowed to do this thing. And so it's a send up of all the expectations around decency and docility and, gentility that Jane Austen's novels are also making fun of. And so I just think it's like a perfect modern version of this. And it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. And the way they punch each other is also funny.
I also want to pop in and not only big up the movie Harvey, which was the original Tyler Durden, except as a bunny rabbit.
Yeah.
But also Snuffleupagus. I mean, just like Big Bird and Snuffleupagus. Now on Sesame Street now, Snuffleupagus is a real guy. But when we were kids, he was an imaginary friend. Nobody else saw him. So he functioned the same way Tyler Durden does, which is as this other self of Big Bird where he can express a part of himself that maybe he doesn't feel comfortable showing.
Where he's like a woolly mammoth or something, right?
Yeah, under his Big Bird persona. So this story of multiple personalities takes many forms.
And there's Calvin and Hobbes, right? I mean, if, we're talking about imaginary friends where you get to express a side of yourself that, you struggle to show anybody else or whatever. There's definitely that. But, I like that one. I don't think that one is one I want to put in the cringe category.
No,
pull that out of there. Amanda, what about you? Is there something that makes you cringe that uses this device?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier that in the mid-20th century, multiple personality disorders was like a tabloid fiction kind of mainstay. And unfortunately, there are some really terrible movies about it, like The Three Faces of Eve, Sybil with Sally Fields. If you ever want to hate yourself, watch that movie. It is the worst piece of shit I've ever. I'd say it may be the worst movie I've ever seen.
Oh my god!
Wow,
I don't think I knew
really
that. We've been together for 16 years.
And it's just so bad. And it's interesting because it's like these kinds of stories, like they go back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and they kind of start off as like these kind of cool explorations of people looking at their dark side. And then once it became like this kind of pseudoscience diagnosis in the mid-20th century, all these sort of stories came out about that made the women who were victims of sexual or physical abuse made them seem like monsters, and used this kind of titillating diagnosis to pretend to sympathize with them, but in fact make a spectacle of trauma porn for these women. And it's gross, and it is kind of my worst case scenario for Moon Knight. I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to be smarter than that. But just to sort of give you an idea of why I have so much trepidation around multiple personality disorders, that movie is particularly a bad example.
What you're saying about that is interesting because that narrative of women not being able to sort of tap into their darker side or really, really understand it and really needing a man to help them, figure it out goes all the way back to Freud too. Freud's earliest patients were mostly women, and they were mostly victims of sexual abuse or sexual violence of some kind. And in almost every case, his way to understand that, of course, is to sort of swan in as the authority to help them understand the thing that they can't access in their own psyches, and then to essentially diagnose them as hysterical. So, of course, women who have stuff going on inside that they can't understand because the world won't allow you to be a complete human being, right? They must be hysterical, right? This deep, dark side of themselves that has sexual desire or has experienced sexual disorder because of abuse. They must really be the problem. It's inside them, not out there in the world, Freud. And
then to make it worse, it takes a problem that if it was treated appropriately could be solved. People recover from trauma all the time. And then they get re-traumatized by the psychologist. They're told that there's something deeply wrong with them as opposed to their circumstances.
Right.
And they get turned again into this spectacle. And that in and of itself is more dangerous than than often the original bad thing that happened to them. And it's just a very fraught territory. I think that when you read some of the new comics, it's clear that they recognize that this is a problem. And so they kind of rewrote Moon Knight to get away from it. So I'm pretty sure the show will do a good job of not doing this and instead kind of using it a little bit more in the fun Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde way.
Well, let's get into that. Amanda, how do you think this split personality of Marc Spector / Moon Knight will play a role in the show's story?
My hope is that they're going to kind of use it to really problematize like the Batman idea.
Well, we're going to talk about Batman later, but yeah.
But yeah, like the vigilante, basically, period. Like Marvel doesn't have a lot of secret identity characters, the MCU anyway, outside of Spider-Man. And so a lot of these characters, they're integrated characters. There's no Clark Kent versus Superman kind of story going on. And we're so used to, prior to Marvel being like, we're not doing secret identities, we're so used to that being part of the superhero story. And so even all the new DC movies, even with Dark Batman, they don't really, I think, really think about how disturbing it is, the idea of having two separate selves. Like, I mean, there's an innocent version of it. We're all a slightly different person at work than we are with our friends and family, you know, et cetera. But like, to literally have a different name, to literally have a secret identity, there's something deeply sinister about that is completely ignored by most stories that tell most superhero stories that use that device. And I'm really hoping that they use multiple personalities to say, like, this is bad. It is bad to not be the same person roughly in most circumstances, like to be so divided against yourself that you have different names, different identities, etc. Not like slight code switching, but literally I'm a different person.
Really hard to find work-life balance when you're two different people doing two different jobs, you know? Yeah.
What about you, Maeve? Something you want to see Moon Knight use this device for inside our 6-episode story?
Yeah, when I was reading the comic books, just the few that I was trying to race through to try to get a sense of this character, I had a bit of an epiphany moment. I was thinking about what it would mean to tell a story about a character who has this sort of fragmented sense of self. And I kept thinking about alienation, you know, the way that these characters are alienated with respect to one another. He's also alienated with respect to his mission because he doesn't really totally understand why he needs to do what he does. He knows what his job is, basically, but he doesn't really know why he's been chosen or what that's all about. And so, you know, we tend to think about alienation as coming from Karl Marx, or a theory of alienation, at least in modernity. And that one doesn't quite work here, because that's about like being alienated from the products of your labor, the creative process. And then, of course, according to Marx, your whole humanity. You're not attached to your humanity or the humanity of others. But Marx does not invent that whole cloth. He gets that from Adam Smith. Adam Smith's theory of alienation is that in industrialization, the work of industrialization, factory labor, but also the sort of mass production of things that capitalism requires. It's not really called all that yet, but for Smith, industrialization turns humans into drudges because our work is drudgery. It's mundane. It is repetitive. And so because of that, we lose our intellectual capacities, and we also lose what he calls our sympathy. And what he means by that is that we lose our capacity to connect emotionally and intellectually to other human beings. His solution to this problem, or the alternative to this, is what he calls the wandering soldier. Now, this is like totally weird, right? Like, at least for us in the modern world, because we look at sort of militarism and through a much more complex lens than Smith did. And I think Smith really misses a ton here. But basically what he says is like the wandering soldier gets to like wander around the world and, smell the flowers and also meet new people, which is also good. That's great. Meet new people, learn new cultures. And in the process, we foster and develop both our intellectual and creative capacities and our sympathetic capacities. So we're actually better citizens. We're better fellow citizens. We build communities better. The problem with that, of course, is that who gets to be the wandering soldier? It's dominant communities get to send out wandering soldiers. And so Smith's analysis kind of misses out on all of the institutional and technological necessities of an imperial nation state that not all nations get to be. So it's not like anybody can choose to be the wandering soldier. First of all, like, how many women are wandering soldiers, according to Smith? Not that many.
Right.
Right. And so I think one thing that might be really interesting here is to think about how alienation is not just the product of industrialization, but it is also a product of the military industrial complex that is the product itself of the modern nation state. So Smith, you got it wrong again. Marc said you got it wrong. And now also this might be a way of kind of another variation on that. You got it wrong, Smith, because you forgot about imperialism. That's my feeling.
Well, speaking of imperialism, the origin of Moon Knight in the comics is essentially, spoiler alert, if you don't want this, I don't think the show's going to use this, so don't feel like you have to skip ahead probably, but the TLDR is a former heavyweight boxer wannabe, became a mercenary, took a job, it led him to Africa. He was betrayed by his boss who killed him and left him to die, and then the Egyptian moon god, Khonshu, resurrected him in return for him going out and fighting evil, right? That's the backstory of the character from the 70s, basically. So Moon Knight is known as the Fist of Khonshu. So let's talk now about our second topic, which is the symbology of Egypt and the moon and how that might play into this story. So Khonshu is also known by a bunch of different names because it is definitely not meant for the sort of like Western language alphabet, right? It's like Kansu, Hans, Kensu, and a bunch of other tweaks on that. However you want to say it, there's a lot of versions of that, right? But he is the god of the moon. He's usually depicted as a young male, which, as y'all noted earlier, is not something we've seen in some of the other religions around this time. Sometimes he has a falcon head, but usually he's a man. He is also one of the gods that's associated with fertility because, hey, who doesn't like to fuck under the light of the moon, right?
I say that every day.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, that's, He's also associated with healing, primarily, though, because he's thought to keep evil spirits at bay, right? The idea would be that you have a disease or an illness or something, and, you want to keep that evil at bay. So you might pray to Khonshu or Khonsu and try to invoke him to hold back that evil. That might be something that plays a role into why there would be this god who's like, hey, I could use a fist right now, and not in like a sex way, but like on the ground doing my work. And, then you might want to be keeping evil or the dead or the undead at bay. And so we don't know a lot about Ethan Hawke's villain character, so there could be some relationship to those kinds of things there. There are also some more old school versions, right? Like most religions, if you go back far enough into Egyptian mythology, you find that most of the gods were just essentially like mob bosses warring over corners.
Yeah.
And there are stories of Khonsu where he's like literally eating other gods that he defeats. So, I don't know, man. I mean, that could also be the kind of violent, I could use a fist right now, a right hand of Khonsu, kind of a thing. So, again, I think they'll rely on some of this backstory, but you could turn him into any kind of a god based on, I think, a lot of the flexibility of these stories, because when they've been told over thousands of years, they, of course, evolved considerably. But there will be a Khonshu or Khonshu in this story, and that presumably means we will get a little bit of Egyptian mythology backstory. So, Maeve, are there any other stories that evoke Egyptian mythology that you dig for anyone who might want to get into it a little bit more before Moon Knight?
I love this little weird novel from the late 19th century called The Beetle. It's by Richard Marsh. And it's a fun little text because it is not quite a multiple personality story or split personality story, but it is a story about a demony thing that is a shapeshifter. So can inhabit other bodies. So it can kind of basically possess human beings, or it can take different shapes on its own. And the fun thing about it that may have, be sort of interesting for folks who are watching this show or turn out to like this show is that the Beetle is also a pretty cool anti-colonial revenge story. Ooh, so fun. The Beetle, this little guy, comes to England because he wants vengeance on a politician who has killed a woman in the temple of Isis. And so is defending the sort of honor of the temple of Isis by trying to show up and not kill the politician, which is kind of funny, to blackmail him, which feels like, I don't know, just like go for the kill, man, right? Like I don't really know why you wanted to blackmail him. It's not like the Beetle needs money. The Beetle is a shapeshifter. It could take the form of a rich person and wander around. But it feels very cool because it's very modern, right? It's like, I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to blackmail you. And then I'm going to expose you for how evil you are, because politicians who lead imperial armies or support them are evil. So it's kind of an implicit anti-colonial story, but it's pretty fun. And it's a nice short little story. It's like, pretty gothic and cool, and, good chance to sort of dig into something fun in 19th century.
Do any gods make an appearance, or is that a spoiler alert?
Not a spoiler alert. No, the Isis does not show up. Isis is constantly being invoked. So
got it.
She doesn't need to be there. She's got her people there,
Well, Khonshu prays to Isis on some sarcophagi that are in, I believe, the Met. So you can go and observe him praying to her in New York City. Amanda, what about you? Any stories that evoke Egyptian mythology that you dig?
Well, first I want to point out that there is a very obvious reason that moon gods and goddesses throughout history have been associated with fertility, Marc.
Not fucking in the moonlight?
No.
That's not a thing?
Oh. I mean,
right, periods. I get it.
Oh, yeah.
It's a 28-day cycle. That must have felt very significant to ancient people. Anyway.
I was trying to be cute. I wasn't trying to be an idiot.
Try again.
Y'all got what now? How does that body work?
I think so. Egyptian stuff isn't necessarily like my strong suit, but I always recommend the History of Egypt series that Terry Jones did. And yes, that's Terry Jones of the Monty Python fame. He is not just a comedian, he's a historian, and he does a lot of these cool BBC documentaries. And the one about Egypt is really, really cool. I learned so much about ancient Egyptians and how much there's a lot of continuity between ancient Egypt and modern Egypt, because it is a continuous culture. There's been the switch from paganism to Islam, obviously, but in a lot of ways, a lot of lifestyles have stayed the same because of the cyclical nature of the Nile and everything. So that's very cool. But it's really helpful to ground something, I think, that is the most obvious thing about ancient Egypt and their mythology to anybody look on the outside looking in, which is how death obsessed it is.
Yeah.
More than basically any religion that I can think of. And sorry about all the cat noises. I have cats fighting at my feet, y'all.
I love it. Is that hissing sound? I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, cats.
The little representatives of Bast are having it out on at my feet.
You look so calm while it's happening. I'm really impressed. I heard the hiss, but I was like, I don't know. Maybe there's something else going on in there.
Yeah. While we're recording, Amanda is having to shake a cat toy off screen because we have a new kitten in the house named Orson, who Maeve is actually the person who saved this kitten. And not to get all the way too distracted into that, but that's the reason we have this kitten, because Maeve was able to save it and is too allergic to keep him, and prepared him and his entire family for adoption out into the world. And we took in Mr. Orson, who is a very sweet, very rambunctious fellow who will probably be making a series of appearances on Storycast until he gets a little older and chills the fuck out. All right. So my last question about mythology stuff is, what about stories around the moon, right? So, okay, cool. Egyptian mythology. Lots of that is going to be in here. I'm super excited about it. I took an Egyptology class in college. I was that dork and I was super into it. I want to learn more. And I'm curious how responsibly and interestingly they invoke it. Amanda, what about stories that revolve around moon symbology? Anything that you're excited about or think about and reflect on as we get into Moon Knight?
Well, thinking about mythologies and moon stuff, I think what's interesting about a lot of moon mythologies is they really kind of are often any stories associated with the moon are about exploring liminal spaces, right?
Yeah.
They're often about the line between life and death. They're about both in the life and non-life. So a lot of moon, like you said, is fertility stuff. So it's like the line between pre-life and life, right? And then the line between life and death. So, which makes sense because the moon's out when we're asleep, and sleeping is like that kind of place in our life where we're between life and death, like symbolically. I think that the cyclical nature of the moon makes people think about these kinds of turning over of life. It makes people think about birth to death because it's the moon actually goes through that cycle but then restarts again. So there's a lot of stories about regeneration, which gets back to the Egypt part because they are very into the idea of life after death. And when you think of kind of modern horror stories in the moon, you think about werewolves and things. They're often also obsessed with that kind of liminal space. Like the werewolf is both man and beast. It is kind of a death of sorts. Like you become something very different. There's just so much about the moon that is associated with both being of this world and not of this world at the same time. And I think it's fascinating and a very good symbol to kind of attach to a character like this.
I've been reading Circe, the Madeline Miller novel.
Oh, so good.
Love that book.
So good. And I just couldn't help but think about the moon, with respect to the representation of it there, where this is just a kind of rehashing of a classical division of powers, which of course is also true of something like werewolf stories, where you have your powers as a human and then your powers as a supernatural being. But in antiquity, you have a division of power between night and day, and it's also gendered, which is different in Egyptian mythology because the god Ra, who is the god of the sun, and then we've got our god of the moon. They're both sort of masculine figures, rather than sort of split in that sort of gendered way. But maybe there's something there for thinking about a sort of troubling or recreating of the association between moons and women, because that's sort of, at least also in sort of Western European traditions, witches are associated with the moon, right? And of course, women and their cycles are associated with the moon, and that's probably the connection to witches, and witches doing scary things at night and under the cloak of darkness and all of that. But it would be interesting if the move here is to use this as also a way of thinking about masculinity, since we've got this character who's obviously wrestling with some of that.
There's also the good side of the witch aspect too. Like there's the kind of Christian and even pagan tradition where witches come out at night under the moon and they're bad, right? But then you also have the goddess Diana of the moon, who is not bad.
And Athena.
Yeah, but the thing about them is that they're still transgressive characters, right? They're virgins. They're masculine in their behavior and their occupation. They are not traditional female figures. And I think that it's again, the moon is often so associated with stories of people that are two often contradictory things at once. And, the Huntress is obviously a really good example of that.
Yeah. Outliers of various kinds. I was thinking too about the fact that back when I was studying Richard Marsh's The Beetle, I was studying this text in graduate school and wrote part of my master's thesis on The Beetle. that text is really interesting because it's interested in hypnosis and it's interested in sort of the theosophists of the late 19th and early 20th century. And they had a whole theory of the moon, that the moon birthed the earth, that the earth comes from the moon. So Madame Helena Blavatsky, who was like, queen of the theosophists, had this whole theory where she was like, so the moon used to be like this like thriving planet, and then it died and it kind of like, belched out its energies, and its energies formed the earth, so that the earth is made of moon. And we look up to our moon parent every night, this sort of, now kind of dead, defunct deity that sort of floats above us in the sky. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, what's interesting there is that we've got this sort of like alternative religion, and their conception of the world as not rotating around the sun, but as rotating around the moon, not physically, but that the moon is the center of our universe. It's a way of kind of sort of stripping power of Judeo-Christianity and attaching it to this alternative religion that, and alternative powers associated with those figures.
Well, that gives us a lot to think about. So Blavatsky, huh? Blavatsky. For those who want to get into that. I mean, the irony, of course, being that the moon is most likely a piece of the Earth that was broken off during some sort of, primordial or asteroid hit or something. Anyway, that's fascinating to think about sort of the reverse relationship here. And Khonshu may or may not be some sort of parental figure to Marc Spector. Let's talk a little bit about Marc Spector in our final category, Bat Stories. So, right. Something you'll see if you go read about Moon Knight on the internet, and something people said, I guess, since the 80s when I became aware of him, is that he's the Batman of the Marvel Universe, right? So presumably that would be because he is a solo masked vigilante. He does a lot of street level work. He's got a lot of resources because in the comics, he was like a rich mercenary. And I shit you not, his Alfred is literally a dude named Frenchie, who was like his driver or whatever. Whatever. But he hid his real identity, which y'all had talked about already, that in this case, he hides his identities. And Moon Knight was a very grim, dark setting. And something Jesse and I talked a little bit about was how Moon Knight might be striking a tonal shift. And I don't know that it's coincidental that Marvel is bringing the Netflix shows back over to Disney Plus around this same time that they're bringing in Moon Knight, because those shows have a little bit more of the tone that the trailers of Moon Knight, at any rate, have suggested this show might have. So let's set aside for a minute the question of whether Batman and Moon Knight are actually good comps, because there are some clear parallels. But, we just got another Batman movie. It's just on the heels of the previous reboot with Ben Affleck. And we've never really gone very long without a Batman reboot. We're on like number 7 or 8 since 1989, right? And it's all raking in the cash. Apparently the new one is really good. I haven't seen it yet. I'm sure I will once it goes onto a streaming service. As a kid, though, I was obsessed. Batman, the 1989, the Tim Burton movie, was maybe a bigger deal to me than anything except Transformers, the movie, and Return of the Jedi. Like, that's like was like a top 3 of like Marc before he could drive. And, we're obsessed with these Bat stories, right? So, Maeve, why do you think, as an American culture, we are so obsessed with Batman-style stories?
Because we love neoliberalism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I buy that.
Tell people what neoliberal is, because I feel like 95% of uses of the word are wrong.
I mean, the way I'm thinking about it in the context of the Batman films is that we've got a character who lives in a world that he imagines needs a kind of progressive reformation. And he comes from a family that sort of believes in helping out the little people, but without actually modifying or challenging the unequal distribution of resources that is fundamentally oppressive. So that's what's neoliberal about the story, the Batman story to me.
I think, again, people need to know that neoliberalism is literally like Adam Smith capitalism. But like it's an argument that capitalism is inherently the free market is a kind of liberalism, right?
And Benthamite utilitarianism, that with this like there's a sort of logic in instrumentalizing capitalism for the ends of mass, not just mass production, but also the reproduction of resources, because under capitalism, the beauty is that money creates money. And that, of course, is what like excited Marx about it. But he was like, the fucked up thing is what we do with it, which is we concentrate those resources in the hands of a few. And then Batman is a story that's like basically an apology for that an explanation for why that's a good thing. Because like, you know what? The fact is, rich people, some of them who have like well-nigh magical capacity to defend the universe, because who can really stay up that late every night? I mean, it's like, come on. But you know, with all that wealth, they could save the world. They could save the world. I mean, it's just bullshit. Like, you know, and it's just a bullshit fantasy. It's like, I've watched Batman movies that I like, but it's not a set of stories that I feel does anything interesting with the superhero story to help us rethink the way we live in the world or the way we imagine the distribution of power.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And again, neoliberal doesn't mean, like people on Twitter use it to mean normie Democrat wine moms. It means it means Bill Gates. It means Mark Zuckerberg. It means this idea that the markets create a freedom that is superior to kind of the redistribution. Yeah. That, you know, some of us that most liberals, I think, would actually agree with. So like modern Republicans are more neoliberal than modern Democrats by and large. But I think I agree with you so much because our culture has so many billionaire fantasies. And I think that's hard, especially for our listeners to really wrap their minds around, because I don't think that's probably true for the typical listener of the show. Yeah. But go out there and look at all the people that worship Elon Musk. That guy is a piece of shit.
Yeah.
You heard it here, friends. He's a piece of shit.
He's a monster.
A true fucking piece of shit. No, I'm going to double down on that take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's out there making fun of people supporting Ukrainian democracy, not to bring it dark, but like,
no, please bring it dark.
And yet people think he's going to be some kind of savior because
give me a break.
Like he's doing this capitalist electric car thing when you know, yes, electric cars are a good idea, but that is literally the worst possible way you could go about it. Like you said, the neoliberal ideal is screwing us because we have the tech to do electric cars on a big scale, but because we won't do the government investment, it's just this like slow, miserable process. And most people just every year are buying gas-powered cars over and over again. Yeah. And yet this fantasy that this billionaire is going to come in and use his money to save us is so powerful. And I blame Batman.
Well, we are obsessed, I think. We feel that the system, as it were, is so broken, right? That people are always hoping for some kind of savior, right? This is why presidential elections take on these outsized personality contests in American culture, because there's some hope, some dream that the right president could push back against all of the inertia of the military-industrial complex and capitalism and Congress and everything that's been crushing forward for the past 200 plus years in America, and, you know, just right the wrongs or whatever. Or that they want Peter Thiel or Elon Musk or Mark Cuban to just, you know, shower XYZ people with money and solve all these issues. But at some level, it's because the system is broken. And Batman stories touch on that too, right? They were stories that I think at a time when it wasn't necessarily as common in American culture to accept how corrupt and terrible cops are. Batman stories, I will say, to their credit, often point out they are bad cops. There are bad cops and there are many bad cops. And some cops are like, some police forces are systemically inherently corrupt and can't really be saved. And there's some real truth to that. And I think that's part of the fantasy too, but it's two sides of the same coin, because again, what you're saying is the ends justify the means, right? Break the law to save the law. Like that never really works out.
I mean, it's worth remembering that Batman was invented kind of right around the time that the New Deal was being passed. And so it was a period where there was a legitimate debate in American society about how to deal with the collapse of capitalism, right? Socialists had one answer, capitalists had another. The New Deal ended up being this compromise situation where we would have some amount of socialism and some amount of capitalism. And like in the real world, sometimes ideologies give way to reality, right? But I think that, I don't know the story of who wrote Batman and why, but I think that you can look back in the 1930s and see a lot of fantasies about rich people swooping in and saving everybody. Yeah. It's not just Batman. There's Little Orphan Annie is a really good example of that kind of story.
Yeah.
There was a lot of these kinds of fantasies because, and they're kind of coming back, I think, again, with the worship of the billionaire now, because we're also in these kind of stressful economic times where that fantasy offers a lot of comfort to people.
I mean, you see it, and it's interesting you say this because I hadn't thought about it that way, where the fantasy of the billionaire swooping in and saving everything comes into play, because you see them also in the early 19th century and in the sort of aftermath of the French Revolution and and Napoleonic Wars, when Britain is also in a kind of state of, uncertain economic future and economic conditions are really, really bad for people. People are starving and dying and can't support their families and can't find work and, are asking the state to, come up with alternatives for them. And then we get stories like Oliver Twist, right? Which is a story about one poor orphan being saved by one rich guy. It's like, the idea, it's very soothing to us to sit around and think like, this is a fun story to read and it feels good because we see this really, magnanimous thing happen. But the fact is that is not the solution to the problem. And I'm not even a person who's like, we need Leninite socialism in order to solve all of our problems. But I do believe that we can come up with something better than like 5 rich people, funding the good in the world. Because the fact of the matter is, then they get to determine what the good is. And that is not democracy.
It hasn't usually worked
oligarchy.
out great when the ultra rich determine what good is. It's like the original Twitter activism was just sitting around hoping for billionaires to solve our problems.
It's interesting too, because it shows that the clean line that we want between propaganda and not propaganda just doesn't exist. What is interesting to me is I don't think that many of these stories actually come from political propagandists who are trying to make a political argument against socialism, against a better welfare state, et cetera. I think it was actually people organically often coming up with fantasies that sold well.
Yeah.
And so that means that there are a lot of people out there that are hungry for this story, and it's worth interrogating why, and it's not just imposed propaganda. And again, Batman isn't being sold to us over and over again because Hollywood is trying to turn everyone into libertarian douchebags.
No, although,
I mean, I really don't think that a lot of these people behind this have that intention.
No,
that might be their inclination as people and as creators, but I don't know that they're trying to sell a political ideology. It's just baked into what they're doing, and it sells crazy because people want to hear it.
Yeah, and it is, and to your point, right? It's not like they're propaganda machines, but they are kind of they're fairly good servants of the ideology because read Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism. Yeah, no, that's right. This is the subject of Lauren Berlant's book Cruel Optimism, which is basically not Batman, although you can read Batman in there, but about the way that we live in a universe that sells us this vision of the American dream as this idea that we could all win the lottery and all be millionaires or billionaires or trillionaires or whatever. And it's like, that isn't even how capitalism works. It's not, yes, some people can become mega wealthy and they have, but not everybody. That's the whole point. Then it's not capitalism any longer. It might as well be an equal distribution. So, and the problem is that it is cruel. It is a cruel narrative that we are sold. And it doesn't come from just one place. So just, Batman isn't the problem, but it is a part of the problem of a machine that continues to sort of generate fantasy narratives about neoliberalism and how this is actually going to be just fine for all of us, while we could actually solve the problem of not just hunger in the United States. We could solve that problem. We could also solve world hunger, by the way, but we're just not willing to do that because we are so obsessed with this vision that somehow it's totally fine that there is this massive inequality of wealth. And the solution is not to stop telling Batman stories, although, we have a lot of them, guys, so I don't know if we really need any more. But we do need to start telling stories that are interested in something other than this obsession with this unequal distribution.
And my hope is that Moon Knight can be that, because in my experience, Marvel does a better job than DC of problematizing some of these fantasies, these propagandistic narratives. I mean, we already have a Marvel Batman. That's Tony Stark, right?
Yeah.
And while he kind of ended on a hero's note, these are hero stories, blah, blah.
Sure.
The arc of a lot of Marvel Cinematic Universe stories are about how Tony Stark's hero complex and his belief that his money can buy the solutions to everybody's problems actually causes more problems than it solves.
Cough, cough, Ultron.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and also Wanda, right?
Yeah.
It's all tied together for sure.
So I kind of hope that they do this to kind of explore the idea that vigilantism and some of the other things that are associated with Batman are not good.
Yeah.
and bad for the person involved, bad for society, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, gang. Well, look, again, we've talked about 3 central components to this story, right? 1, split personalities, the debunked multiple personality disorder concept that is based on something much more real called dissociative identity disorder. But this idea that there's all these works out there that love to draw on the idea of like different people living in the same body, and that a lot of these stories have to do with science gone wrong. But here we're faced with a character who is much more a mythical version of that kind of story. We'll see whether or not they draw on some of the works that Maeve and Amanda referenced, everything from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to werewolf stories to both versions of The Invisible Man to Jennifer's Body to a rabbit named Harvey. Jane Austen's Fight Club is a short film I'll be checking out as a result of this conversation. And of course, a second aspect of the character is the symbology of Egypt and the moon, right? Amanda talked to us about Terry Jones' documentary, The Hidden History of Egypt, and Maeve talked to us about Richard Marsh's The Beetle. We'll talk about, whether or not, we'll learn soon enough whether Khonshu is the old school Egyptian god who used to eat other gods for fun, or maybe like a more chill fertility bro. We'll see.
Who's into fisting.
And finally, hopefully that Moon Knight offers Marvel an opportunity to critique a little bit about the Batman story and hopefully bring some of those ideas forward. All right, Amanda, if folks want to talk to you more about any of these ideas, where can they find and follow you?
I'm at salon.com. I write there every day, and you can always find me on twitter.com.
Maeve, where can people find and follow you?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Maeve Adams.
All right, legendary listeners, that is our show for today. If you're enjoying it, please leave us a 5-star Apple review as we get into Moon Knight so we can rise up in some search rankings. It would mean the world to us. And if you want to stick with me, you can find me on the Marvelous TV Club Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, all at Marvelous TV Club. I'm also on Twitter at Marc Folletti, MarcFaletti. All right, team, it's time for us to go out in the desert and I guess find ourselves a fertility god.
Can't wait.